Pretty soon.
Listen, everybody, welcome to LoveBabz, LoveTalk, the second hour, and I'm talking to David Jolly, who is the national chairman for Serve America movement, which is, we know as SAM. I've had Monty Frank here a couple of times talking about some of the movement, but David Jolly used to be in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2014 to 2017. Did all kinds of stuff in the Congress. You were a member and worked outside of Congress and practicing securities attorney. I mean, all the things. About the national perspective on SAM, right? The Serve America movement. Y'all have gotten political status in a couple of places. Texas, right?
Yeah, 4 states: Texas, Pennsylvania, New York, and Connecticut.
Yes. And you're doing some work in St. Louis too, trying to move them along.
Yeah, okay, that's right.
Give me the national perspective, because there's a lot going on. I mean,
sure.
SAM exists because Democrats and Republicans and independents came together and said, we got to do something else.
Well, that's right.
Because we have to do something else, it's critical now. So talk to me about the national perspective and why this means why this is important.
Yeah, sure. So look, the national perspective, SAM is an organization, the Serve America movement. It's a coalition of, relatively independent-minded, reform-minded voters, left, right, and center. And that's the key here. It is a big tent coalition. This is not an organization that's trying to be Republican light or Democratic light or trying to be centrist. This is kind of a love all, serve all, regardless of your ideology. If you've got an independent political mind, a reform-minded approach to politics, then we want to sit at the same table and figure out solutions to the problems that face us, from education to healthcare to immigration to taxes to whatever it might be. Look, it has grown out of a frustration that perhaps the way the current system is set up protects the two major parties, doesn't really drive consensus. It just creates this ideological swing depending on who's in charge. And at the end of the day, very little actually gets done. So as you mentioned, we have formed or filed party formation paperwork in 4 states. We ultimately believe that the United States would benefit from more political parties, 3, 4, 5. That's the way most Western democracies do it. And you have this coalition building that creates greater participation, greater diversity of representation, greater consensus making. But we're also not naive. You can't just start a political party overnight. You really have to build a grassroots coalition. So in Connecticut, the SAM Connecticut chapter largely grew out of as you mentioned, the gubernatorial campaign of Oz Griebel and Monty Frank. Following that race, and infrastructure naturally developed around this reform movement. And now we are looking at recruiting and running candidates in municipalities across the state.
And you've done so here, right?
That's right.
And they're doing well.
Yes. Listen, in 2 weeks now is Election Day in Connecticut. The mayor of Newtown, Connecticut will be elected as a SAM registered party candidate. Now, he's an incumbent, and this is kind of a neat story. It shows the approach to SAM. He's an incumbent who started to just think, look, we can't let this national partisan divide come into all of our communities, particularly for municipal and city government, where there's no Republican or Democratic way to fill a pothole. You got to get the work done. You got to fill the pothole. And so he decided it was in his interest to deregister as a partisan affiliate, as a Democrat. And so then he considered running as an independent or actually affiliating with SAM. And he chose to affiliate with SAM. So he will. And then what happened? This is fantastic, Babz. You know what happened? So he registers and he says, look, I'm going to lead what is the Serve America movement here in Newtown as Newtown mayor. And the Republican and Democratic parties in Newtown turned around and endorsed him. So he will be elected with the endorsement of the major parties, but with the Sam label. And we really think that's where the opportunity lies in a lot of the cities and towns across Connecticut and the other states that we're in.
Wow. So, all right. So y'all are trying to take on a whole bunch of advocating for a whole bunch of things: open public primaries, ranked choice voting, and we saw that play out in New York, which was interesting. Open public primaries, early voting, and absentee voting. So how do you do that when you start to see the Republican Party leading this voter disenfranchisement movement, where municipalities and governments across this country are trying to limit voting opportunities as opposed to expanding them? How do you combat that message?
Yeah, so at SAM, it's a fairly basic principle. We think voting should be as easy and accessible as it can be secure. And you're right, what we're seeing in states across the country is a limitation on people's franchise. But I would also point out, we are seeing dramatic examples in largely Republican-led states right now that arguably are having a disparate impact on communities of color. But I would also say, as we're examining Georgia and Texas and other states, they at least allow early voting of 8 to 10 days, right? The story was that they were dropping it from 20 to 10. Connecticut doesn't allow early voting at all, as I understand it. I mean, this is not just a Republican and Democratic, just a Republican issue. The parties have these hurdles in place to greater voter participation. At SAM, we want to break those down. Now, you mentioned electoral reforms, and this is really where the rubber meets the road for the emergence of independent candidates and ultimately new parties. Primaries are closed, right? So in Connecticut, just over 40% of voters, I believe, register as no party affiliation. They don't want to affiliate directly with the R's or the D's. Well, as a result, they don't get to contribute to the primary process. They only get to show up in November to see what the two parties have produced for them. Well, that's in direct contradiction to their independent politics. Why do they only get a choice between R's and D's? And then ranked choice voting is one that gets a little more complicated, but ultimately what it ensures is that whoever wins actually got the greatest consensus among the voters. It's not just somebody who got 25% and now they were elected. And then a big one is undoing gerrymandering. And this is a tool of both major parties. Whoever's in charge, they want to make sure they stay in charge. And the way they do that is they draw legislative lines to protect their own party.
So do you feel like you have to go, as you're running around the country talking about the Serve America movement, do you feel like you have to spend a lot of time re-educating people about what voting is, the rights to vote and all of that? I mean, do you feel like you have to go in and teach voting before you even get people to listen to you about a third party?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, Babz, because I would say culturally, we have largely assumed that we can trust our elected officials. Right? We all get to say, those politicians, they're just politicians. But the truth is, most of us go about our day on priorities of family, of community, of church, of civics, of our job, and we just kind of trust that the politicians are going to keep things running and keep things moving forward, and there's going to be some wins and losses along the way. Well, in allowing them to really run everything, what they've done is they've controlled the process in a way that simply protects them and reduced the voters' ability to hold our politicians accountable. And so, unfortunately, there is some education that has to be involved. I'll give you an example of how politicians can, just by tweaking the rules, really screw things up. And it's through the gerrymandering process. In the state of Georgia in 1990, there were, I believe, 8 Democrats and 3 Republicans, somewhere about that, but I believe it was 8 and 3. Republicans were able to wrestle control of the drawing of district lines in the states. And though the population of Georgia stayed the same, it's not like a bunch of people moved in and a bunch of people moved out, because Republicans got to draw the maps. They created maps that had 8 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Now, if you're a voter, you're saying, wait a minute, what just happened? My state flipped from blue to red? Did all the Democrats move out and a bunch of Republicans move in? No, that's not what happened. The politicians set the rules. So what we're trying to do ultimately is put the power back in the hands of voters. Let them draw district lines, let them participate in more primaries, have ranked choice voting where the most number of voices influence the winner, and ultimately empower voters over the politicians.
So what do you make of Stacey Abrams and her commitment to the education of folks around voting and working with people across this country about their voting rights and getting people to the polls? I mean, do you feel like you're aligned with that thinking?
Yeah, we absolutely are. I will tell you, Stacey Abrams, the great work she's doing is basically in turnout, right? How do we ensure that the most number of votes are able to turn out? And so she is interested in some of these reforms, but it's really a focus on turnout. And I would say this is certainly not a knock on her, because she is due great commendation for the work she's doing. She is a Democrat, and what we do find at the end of the day is Democrats and Republicans, even if they want as many voters to turn out as possible, they're still going to represent the interest of their party and try to strengthen their party's representation. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why parties exist. What we believe, though, is if about a third of the country is registered as Democrats and a third of the country is registered as Republicans, and about a third or even up to 40% registered as no party affiliates, it would seem to us that if that's the largest constituency, they should have the largest voice. But there's no leadership of that independent constituency. And in large part because I think parties in the past, independent parties, have made a huge mistake in thinking that independent constituency must all be centrist. They're not. They're not ideologically the same. That independent constituency is all over the ideological spectrum. And so what Sam's trying to do is say, wherever you are ideologically, let's build a coalition of independent-minded, reform-minded voters that'll really disrupt the system and hopefully drive consensus in our policymaking.
Well, how do you do that, David, if everybody's all over the place and you can't get to the meeting of the minds? Like, how do you herd cats? How do you do that?
No. Because of this. It's very simple. Some people approach politics strictly through an ideological lens, right? You are passionate about progressive politics on the issue of abortion, perhaps, or on immigration. Or maybe you're a passionate conservative on deregulation or immigration, whatever it might be. That's fine. The parties exist as a home for that type of committed ideology. But I promise you, and I'm reflective of this in my own personal politics, not everybody approaches politics first and foremost based on ideology. We simply want a government that works and works for the most number of people and solves the issue of education and healthcare and immigration. And what happens is you have the Republicans, for instance, who say, hey, the way to solve immigration or solve education is through school choice. And you have the Democrats who say, no, the way to solve it is through greater funding of public schools. Well, the answer is probably both, right? Why can't we have the best public schools in the entire country, but also allow parents some ability to choose where their kids go to school? There's nothing wrong with approaching both of those answers, but today's system doesn't allow it. So what we're trying to do is say, wherever you are on the solution, if we're committed to just solving the problems that we face, then we gather around those principles. And right now, the parties gather around ideology. We're trying to build a coalition of voters gathering around problem solving, electoral competition, accountability, transparency, civility, the basic behaviors that we should see in our government that we really no longer do.
So how do you not fall prey to becoming a party in the same way that the R's and D's are? Like, how do you not become so institutionalized by the very that you don't want to be institutionalized?
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, we have to guard against that, right? I mean, this is where leadership of the party in Connecticut and Texas and around the country does matter, that we guard against it. I will tell you, one of the ways that we haven't even started the slippery slope towards that yet is because if you take Sam's approach, we're not a party that dictates policy positions from the top down. At any current political party, the R's, the D's, the Greens, the Libertarians, at the national level, they decide on a set of ideologies. You have to be this on abortion, or this on taxes, or this on immigration, or this on deregulation. And then all of their candidates, regardless of where they are in the country, Connecticut, Texas, Wyoming, all have to agree on those things and have to run on that platform. Sam doesn't do that. What Sam says is we're going to build an infrastructure to elevate people who are committed to solving the problems. An Oz Griebel ticket with Monty Frank, for instance. And the National Party doesn't tell Oz and Monty what Connecticut needs. We trust that Oz and Monty will know what Connecticut needs and will come up with answers. Those answers might look different from what our candidates in Utah and California and Texas are elevating, but that's fine. As long as we have this like-minded coalition of people that are putting voters first, putting independent thinking first, and are simply trying to solve the problems, that prevents us a little bit from getting in this ideological warfare with the two major parties. We are trying to elevate the voices closest to the constituencies that Sam candidates are being elevated from.
So when we come around to picking a new president, and we will in a couple of years, how do you get in on that action? How do you know what I mean? Like, what do you do? Like, how do you talk to these candidates? I mean, do you put something in front of them and say, listen, I want you to consider, or we want to endorse you, or do you do that? Like,
it's a great question. I will tell you, we would have to run a candidate in all 50 states, qualify for the ballot in all 50 states, and the parties make that very hard. So first, on identifying and endorsing or recruiting a candidate for any office, a lot of people say, I get the Sam concept, but how do you have a party that doesn't have a platform on issues? We do take positions on issues. Our candidates do. It's just that the party doesn't. The party supports candidates that take some pretty reform-minded position on issues. And so a presidential candidate, a Connecticut gubernatorial candidate, the mayor of Newtown, they're going to take very strong positions on issues, and they're going to run on those, and voters are going to say, yay or nay, I agree with that. That's fine. But I will say this, because it leads to a question that often comes up, which is the spoiler question, right? Would the Serve America movement really get behind an independent presidential run if that candidate couldn't be viable? And the answer is no. We're not interested in playing a spoiler role. In fact, in this last cycle, in the 2020 cycle, we had an opportunity to endorse or run a candidate for president. There were candidates out there that were seeking our endorsement. We held a ballot line in New York and other states, but we took a pass because we did not want to even peel off 1 or 2% of the voters and distort what was otherwise a historic, very important one-on-one race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So I don't know that Sam would play in a presidential race in 24 unless it just really appeared that the heartbeat of American politics was driving towards an independent candidacy that could be viable against the two major parties.
So talk to me, David, about money. Money is a big deal. I mean, it costs a lot of money to run for any office now, not even just, at the local level, people are raising a lot of money to run. How do you have that conversation? Because I will tell you, people are like, if you could just take money out of politics, which I think is a little disingenuous, because you need money to do all the things, right, to get your message out. But where you get your money from is important. So
sure. So you only need money because we don't have public financing of campaigns. Right. I'm a campaign finance reform advocate, which sounds crazy coming as a former Republican, but I actually think we should have public financing of campaigns. We should open up the public airways about 4 weeks out from an election and provide candidate time for a certain amount of time every day. And I actually think we should do the European model and prohibit the spending of campaign dollars on network television and cable television commercials. I think we should just use the power of the FCC and say, no political advertising. Now, they get tested in the courts, and I'd love to make that argument. But to your point, we have to raise money to be competitive in any political race. And that affects the races we decide to get into. In this last cycle, Sam had about a half dozen candidates interested for running for Congress, and a couple that did as a Sam affiliate. But we didn't have the resources for those races. So we have to pick and choose where we can have the resources that make sense. And that's also where looking at townships and municipalities like in Newtown, like yesterday, we had a meeting in Hartford with a group of people interested in doing something there. It may be by focusing on local city and township races, the barriers to entry are a little less when it comes to resources. But we need resources. This movement doesn't grow without people keeping the engine running.
So do you create a PAC? Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you do that and still stay true to your ideas?
Yeah. So look, I will share because this is transparent. One of our tenets is transparency. So we don't operate through any dark money vehicle. So if you were to spend an hour going through the IRS website, you would see that Sam has been able to raise probably between $4 and $5 million in the last 4 to 5 years. Now there were some different, ebbs and flows. At the start, there were a lot of people who contributed money and a lot of high dollar donors who simply said, look, I just want to disrupt this two-party system because it's not working. And then we've had the very low dollar donors that are committed to the independent movement. So we have to raise money for Sam National, and then we have to raise money at the state level and for each of our candidates. Now, everything's transparent, and candidates' color of money, if you will, has to be different than our operational color of money. So what you will see in a Sam candidate, for instance, we will have very likely a ballot line in the Connecticut governor's race next year. We will nominate a gubernatorial candidate here in Connecticut next year, and you will see that Sam candidate aggressively have to try to raise resources to compete with the other candidates on the ballot.
Wow. So do you determine if that's a success or not? Like, how do you measure success of what you're doing? Like, how do you decide what makes sense and what doesn't make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you from an organizational perspective, because I'm the chairperson responsible for, whether this ultimately works or not. Every metric is pretty much going up, trending up, from volunteers who just sign up and want to participate or organize in their states, to small dollar donors, to large donors, to the media saturation, if you will. This continues to grow and grow quickly. Now, it's a small universe of numbers, right? So we recognize that. So as we are growing, we have to determine where to make additional investments. And that's where we do believe Connecticut is a fantastic place to invest in.
So talk to me, because I know you have to go. I know you're busy, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how do you engage Black and brown people? Yeah.
So that's a fantastic question. And in some ways, I would turn around and ask you, because I'm the wrong person to answer that. No, listen, this is very important. I think the problem is a lot of our politicians talk to any community, particularly communities of color, as though they have all the answers instead of just listening more. And that's one of the things that our SAM candidates really pledge to do, is to listen to diverse voices throughout their constituency and arrive at solutions that make sense. The one thing I will tell you in the data is that communities of color, more so than any other voting bloc, continue to register as unaffiliated voters at a higher acceleration, if you will, than other constituencies. Young voters are probably right there with them as a competitive bloc for who's kind of rejecting the two major parties the most. Now, what we do know, though, is voter registration is only one piece of voter behavior. The other is voter performance on election day. And historically, we all know that the trend in modern political history has been communities of color largely trend towards Democratic voters, but that is beginning to chip away a little bit. And that is where I, as the chairperson, and us as Sam, have to do a lot of listening to understand why is that. Why are communities of color beginning to turn away from the major parties or the Democratic Party? And what are the solutions that would drive them to affiliate with an organization like SAM? That happens from us doing a lot of listening. Actually, in Hartford yesterday, I will tell you, we sat around a table with about 15 people of all races, all ethnicities, and all walks of life, and just did a lot of listening for how SAM could help in Hartford specifically, but also in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm. So are you doing that across the country? Because, listen, Connecticut is a little different, but maybe not so different than Mississippi or Alabama or those states that sort of went the freakish Trump way. Well, let me rephrase that. The Trump phenomena, which swept through places that I was quite stunned by. How do you have these kinds of conversations in those places?
Yeah. So two topics, one culture and one just the data experiment. On culture, you're right. Look, I'm a son of the South, born and raised in the South. My father was a Southern Baptist minister. I lived in and out of rural towns, some metro areas, but honestly, my roots are all pretty much rural South. And so issues of race and communities of color, everybody knows the history of the South with that. But I will tell you, the North is not without its own.
I agree.
Right. No, I say that very carefully, particularly as a visitor in the state this week. But you can see how communities are largely segregated around race throughout the country, whether it's Connecticut or Mississippi or out west. And so we have to attend to that, and we have to make sure. And this is where I think the major parties get it wrong. Look, if a party suggests that their candidates must represent or must have a position on this issue that represents this, well, you're naturally going to have a candidate that's out of touch probably with 50% of the country. Because if it doesn't start with listening to the community from which the candidate is being elevated, well, then you're never going to capture communities across the country if it's this top-down ideology, because it's never going to represent communities in Mississippi and Connecticut equally. Now, that's kind of the cultural conversation. On the data, I will tell you, for the new party movement, and this is important, there's a lot of studying. Is it more viable for a party like SAM to emerge in a blue state, in a purple state like Florida or Texas, where it's 50-50? Or does it make more sense in a state like Connecticut, where it's so slanted towards one party or the other, or California, where it's deep blue and the Republicans really aren't viable? And it may be at states like Connecticut where the emergence of a new party might make more sense, because if you're not a Democrat, you don't really see a viable Republican Party, and perhaps the National Republican Party doesn't represent your values anyway. And so the idea of SAM might be something that intrigues you. That's
interesting. And you sort of got to this place because of the data, or you got there because of lived experience?
Both. Look, I was always kind of an independent-minded, almost cynical Republican since I joined when I was at 18. There were always things within the party where I saw this dogma that was so inflexible and couldn't respond to really critical moments, mass violence, gun shootings, or immigration, or early childhood education. I was part of a party that would just turn its head and say, not our issue, we don't have to worry about it. I never really understood that. So part of my personal journey, and maybe it's because I'm the son of a minister, has always been a bit of this love all, serve all approach to politics and all things in life. But when you look at the data, and there's a lot of data science around this, there are leading scholars who have tried to understand, why is the United States the only major democracy with only two major parties? What rules are in place that prevent the emergence of multiple parties in the United States? And that's where you then have to start look at, okay, which states might make the most sense? And that's where at SAM is, we had the resource conversation. With limited resources, we have to determine what states can we be most effective. And that's where we believe Connecticut is one of those states we can be most effective. And it very well might be, because Connecticut Democrats are taking some voters for granted because they've got a lock on most of the state politics.
Mm. So, let me take a little shift here. What are you most hopeful about? I mean, what are you hopeful about America? Yeah. I mean, can we be hopeful about America? Because there's so much, that is wearing us down. And I think on the heels of losing General Powell, I think we're starting to feel a little bit disenchanted. And I think I'm starting to sort of see a disenchantment of the political process in everyday practical people that I never saw before, right?
Completely.
So I mean, where are you in your heart and mind about where America is going?
Yeah, so I love that question, because I have to have that conversation with myself often. And I would say, first and foremost, before we get to the spirit of optimism, let's get to the spirit of resiliency. Because I will tell you this, and I really mean this. This is not Pollyanna. If those of us who believe change is needed and that there are voters being left behind, that there are that there are franchises being taken away from voters, that there are voices that are being quieted, if we stop fighting to reform our system, then we lose, right? Then the people who want to just leave us all behind, they win. If there's no fighters in the ring doing what we're trying to do at SAM, or doing what Stacey Abrams is trying to do, or doing what a lot of the reform-minded politicians are trying to do, if we just think that this fight can't be won and we walk away, well, then we lose. And I'm not willing to lose. I want to keep. We have 2 young kids under the age of 3, and I want them to know every day that I want them to know that Dad fights for what he believes in, and you should too. So first of all, that's the spirit of resiliency that probably overcomes any concerns about whether we ultimately can win or not. But in the spirit of optimism, I'd say this: it is important to recognize we still have remarkable individual freedoms in the United States. These fights we're having them in a ring that's been built for us because we've invested in personal freedom and we're allowed to do these things. What's happened, I think, is this freedom is being used for bad purposes. Gorbachev once said knowledge can be used for good or evil. Well, so can freedom. And so, the one point of optimism is we still have the right to fight for what we believe this country should look like. And if you go simply to this kind of independent political movement, we know that 40% of the country is trying to make a change, that they're saying we're not willing to accept the partisanship. That doesn't mean the 2 parties are bad. It doesn't mean that they're not going to exist for a long time. It just means that more than a third of the country says, you know what, I think we should approach immigration and healthcare and education, all these other issues, with a spirit of trying to solve it for the most number of people, not just for an ideological perspective of one of the major parties.
David Jolly, I enjoyed this conversation.
Hey, good to be with you. Thank you, Babz.
I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much, and welcome to our state.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you, and good luck, and I hope to hear from you again.
All right. Thank you, Babz.
Yep, take good care. Okay, Harry Droz, it's time for us to get up out of here. Harry, tomorrow, I need to jump off at 10 because, I've got to go to the doctor and get my my 1 month checkup out of post-surgery. So I'm going to do that tomorrow. But that was a good conversation with David Jolly, the national chairman for Serve America Movement, SAM. We've had Connecticut, Monty Frank on a couple of times talking about this party and the movement that they're trying to build. So thank you all for tuning in. I'm on my way out, good people. Have a good day. I'll see y'all soon. Harry, play us out. Wherever Harry is. I don't know where Harry is. Harry's in the office.
Harry's here, but
around. I'm on my way out, Harry.
All right. I'm juggling over here.
I know. Every day you're juggling.
Every day I'm juggling. All right.
So,
well, see you tomorrow.
All right. I'll be here tomorrow. See y'all.